Hi, everybody. Kate here with Couts Family Vineyards. I have Craig Rous with us today, one of our fabulous winemakers and the grape grower for the Ironstone Ancient Vine Zinfandel. So welcome, Craig. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Thanks. So we have partnered with Lodi Wine on the Save the Old Vines campaign, and we are going to go through a historical journey to talk about how beautiful some of these wines can be when they are made from these older and ancient vines. History is very important to us here in Lodi. It's very important to the Couts family, and we wanted to make sure that some of these vines stay in the ground. Part of enjoying a glass of wine is knowing where it's come from, the history of it, sense of place, who made it, and how it got into your glass. So the more history behind that vine is the more story in the glass, and that's part of why I drink wine, at least.
Me too.
Okay. Yeah.
It's a great story.
Yeah, exactly. So we are going to start with the Ironstone Classic Zinfandel. Do you have the bottle there, Craig? You can
I do. Let's
hold that
see.
for us.
There we go.
That's the one. She's a
That's the
beauty.
classic.
Yep. So all of the vines for this wine come from vineyards that are between 45 and 65 years old. So it's important to note here that there's no technical definition on the word old vine. We're working on that, getting that defined out. But as of right now, there's no definition on that. So when you see old vine on a label, you really have to ask, how old are these vines, right? Some people try to trick you with that as a marketing gimmick, but we do things right here. So these are between 45 and 65 years old. Do you have any in your glass, Craig? Are you tasting today?
I do. Here it is right here.
Look at that.
See? So yeah, I can swirl it, and this one it's old vine, but as Kate was saying, it's 45 to 65 years old. You tend with younger vines to get more fruit, more blackberry, plum characters. The way that Ironstone makes this wine also, it emphasizes the fruit and sort of de-emphasizes the oak. So this wine has been in oak about 3 months, so not a long time. But we're really looking forward to smelling that blackberry and plum character that is so prominent here in this younger vines. They're still old, but they're younger.
The youngest of the three will taste today, at least. Yeah, I find this wine to be much more of that, as you were saying, fruit forward, rich, round, almost supple style Zinfandel. I think sometimes Zinfandel gets this reputation of being this massive juggernaut of a wine that's always huge and powerful and overwhelming. But when you're making wines with these slightly older vines, even when they're the younger ones, 45 years old, it's more of that gentle, soft, supple. And then when the winemaking team, has balance and that sort of delicacy in mind, you get more of this juicy, fruit-forward, supple style.
The tannins in Lodi are not as powerful as you get in some other areas, so much more approachable, much more drinkable wines. Just the explosion of fruit is really what we're looking for in this classic old vine Zinfandel.
So why is Lodi such a great climate for Zinfandel in particular?
Well, that's a good question, because Lodi itself is a really great place to grow grapes, wine grapes. It has very cool nights, and by that I mean even in the summertime, it's not uncommon to have temperatures in the very low 50s at night. And during the daytime, yes, we can get quite warm. It can be around 100. But most of the time it's around 90 during the daytime, and nighttime 52, 53, very pleasant. So that diurnal change really helps retain the acidity. It develops the colors well. So just the temperatures, if nothing else, the temperatures are ideal for grapes, and particularly Zinfandel. Zinfandel actually likes a little bit warmer region than, say, Cabernet or other varieties. Now, the other thing that makes Lodi really unique, and particularly the McCollum sub-appellation of Lodi, is that we have this really sandy soils. Zinfandel likes really well-drained soils. And so sand, it doesn't come much better drained than sand. And there's tremendous amount of sand in some of these soils, particularly in this McCollum sub-appellation of the Lodi appellation. So between those two things, the soils and the temperatures, really makes Lodi a great place for Zinfandel.
Awesome. And that's another reason I think, now correct me if I'm wrong, why Zinfandel has persevered through phylloxera in Lodi, because it doesn't do well, phylloxera doesn't do well in sand.
That's correct, yeah. Lodi, many of the old vines in Lodi are planted on their own root. And the only way they can get away with that is to not have the pests in the soil that would attack them. Phylloxera, which of course we've all heard about in France and then in Napa fairly well within the last 30 years, doesn't like sandy soils at all. In fact, they just are not here. And so even though they're on own root, these really old vines still do well because there's no phylloxera, because it's so sandy. So yeah, that's a really good point. Lodi, the guys way back when knew where to plant Zinfandel, and Lodi's it.
They got something right for sure.
They sure did. They got it right.
So when these vines were planted around 1955, I mean, obviously we've had major technology shifts between 1955 to 2020, which is when we're doing this now. What are some of the either grape growing or winemaking techniques that were happening in 1955 when these vines were planted?
Well, let's just say in the early 60s and so forth, we started to see a real shift in Lodi, the grape growing styles. These vines may have been the last ones planted on what we call head train. They're trained on like a goblet. So they may have been the last ones planted. We don't see that anymore. Also, they were still furrow irrigated, and we're beginning, of course, now everything is drip irrigated. So things were different for just technology like irrigation.
So furrow irrigated.
Really,
sorry, would you explain furrow irrigated? It's
furrow irrigation. Yeah, if you have flat ground, you actually pull a ditch and fill it with water. And it goes all the way down to the end. Now imagine really sand, like a beach sand. It's really hard to do that, to fill it with water and get the water to the end of the row. So yeah, the guys back then struggled with that. And so irrigation was not really well done because of that. Of course, nowadays it's very, very easy to irrigate with drip irrigation, and you can control exactly how much water you want. Back then, not so easy. So it's more difficult to establish the vineyards than it is now, certainly.
Yeah.
Winemaking, yeah, now we have much, back in the 60s, you really didn't have very many barrels. Hard to imagine, isn't it? Not that long ago, but California didn't have very many barrels to age wine in. Of course, the French have been doing it forever, but I think it started in California in the 70s, where people really started saying, okay, quality wines should be put in barrels. And that wasn't the case in California back then. So yeah, just something that simple.
Yeah,
irrigation is amazing. Yeah, we really didn't have it. Winemaking techniques, we didn't have very good temperature control. Again, hard to imagine, not that long ago, but temperature control was more difficult back then than it is now. So some really fundamental winemaking changes, a lot of new technology that even in the lifespan of these grapes, some significant changes.
That's really cool. So I wrote down some, major historical events that these wines have seen, and it's kind of cool. And I wanted to do this for each set of wines. And it's kind of neat as you go back further and further. So things that these vines have seen: the Beatles' first song, Love Me Do, the entirety of the Vietnam War, Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, Sesame Street's first episode, Watergate, the first Jaws movie, and these vines have seen presidents from Trump, Obama, George W., Clinton, Reagan, Carter, Ford, Nixon, Johnson, Kennedy, and Eisenhower. These grapes have seen all of that. Isn't that kind of cool?
That's going back a ways, isn't it?
Yeah.
And here we are just a week away from election, so that was kind of neat, the presidents.
Yeah, I thought that was kind of neat. It really gives sense of perspective of time, because 45, 65 years old, it sounds like a long time, but when you look at it in the span of world events and things that these vines have lived through, it really puts it in perspective.
Yeah, it really does.
Yeah.
It really does.
Okay, so shall we move on to the reserve, Ironstone Reserve? Sure. Okay.
Yep. Okay. Here's the reserve bottle and label. Let's see. Can you see that okay?
It's beautiful, Craig. Gorgeous. Okay, so we jumped up to the reserve series. There we go. So all of these vines come from 5 different vineyard sites that are between 65 to 85 years old. So we went from 45 to 65. Now we're in 65 to 85. And tell me a little bit more about the characteristics that we can expect from this bottle.
Okay, now we're going to see many of the same things, but they're going to have quite a bit more intensity. The vines, of course, now I think of them as older vines now, and they self-crop themselves. So the fruit characters, you're still going to have a really nice blackberry, still very elegant, but it's not going to hit you quite as much in the face. These have been aged in French oak barrels for 12 months instead of 3, like the classic. It's just a little bit longer finish. I think a better way to describe it is just softer, more rich, more complex. All the same characters, just more of them. Yeah,
so it's like this beautiful balance of more intensity, yet also more elegance. In that way. So it's not, the intensity isn't necessarily aggressive intensity. It's more of a longer lasting, deeper style of intensity.
Correct.
Which is what you expect from a reserve series wine.
Yeah. You want a wine that's going to be a little bit more on your palate, a little richer, more complex, and you definitely get it. The classic is really a good Zinfandel. This one gets into the category we go, wow, this is really nice. This is elegant, soft, but really mouth-filling. This is what I really like about a Zinfandel, and particularly in the older vines in Lodi. Again, the tannins are not aggressive at all. It's very soft in the mouth, but still very rich and mouth-filling, but not aggressive tannins whatsoever. And that's kind of a classic Lodi character for Zinfandel.
Absolutely. And I think for me, even the food pairings change quite a bit. So for the first one, I would do more of like a simple barbecue or, beautiful margarita pizza in the oven or something like that. Whereas this one, I would step up the food to a more intensity notch to more of like a braised beef, bolognese, rabbit, something with a little bit more to back it up. I mean, great with pizza too still, of course, but it has the intensity to balance out some of those heavier foods, whereas the younger one, might not stand up to a rabbit bolognese, for example. Yeah, cool. And so, so these grapes were planted between 1935 and 1955, so we're going back even further. Can you tell me a little bit about the history of the winemaking back then? I know obviously you weren't around, but...
No. I was born in 1955, so I caught the very last year.
I should have added you to the history of the first ones. Craig was born.
So the way that things would have been done back then, they would have not had as many technical things in the vineyards. It would have been much more hands-on. Of course, anything that's planted in that time, of course, would have been all hand pruned. It would have been all hand developed. Everything would have been by hand, and it would have probably been by the farmer and maybe his family. There weren't an awful lot of large farms back then, so everything was done kind of in-house. I didn't describe that in the newer vines, but that's certainly the case. There's many more large acreages now, as opposed to back then. They were relatively small. A 20-acre patch was pretty large back then.
Yeah.
So pretty much the family would have done it. Irrigation would have been, maybe if they had the water, they would have had furrow like we talked about earlier. Now, many of these may have been dry farmed. In California back then, the water tables were different, and so the soils had much more available water than they do now. That's a real problem in California, but back then, they may have been dry farmed when they were developed. So considerably different than what we see now. Winemaking, yeah, boy, it would have been pretty primitive. You may have had, I don't think you're going to have anybody stepping on the grapes and squashing them with their feet, but they may have had wood presses and hand cranks and so forth. It would have been pretty primitive in comparison to what we have now. Very little technology, all done in sort of the old style.
Yeah. And that makes sense that the size of the farm would be small as well, because having to do all of that, as you said, manual labor, vine by vine, with the planting and the pruning and then the harvesting and then the making of the wine. I mean, one family can really only do so much.
They can only do so much.
Right.
Yeah. So that's a big difference between what we see now and then.
Yeah. And I have some great video of what harvesters look like now on younger vines and what it looks like now, if, for example, in your vineyards with the head-trained vines that we're talking about with all of these Zinfandels, and it's completely different. And you can see just how much longer each vine takes to tend.
Yeah.
It's really neat.
And how many more people it takes to do it. Yeah, it's amazing how many people are required to hand harvest a vineyard. It just, one person can, in an 8-hour shift, can maybe get a ton picked. That's a lot. That's moving right along. With a machine pick, it's a whole different ballgame. They can really pick grapes fast.
Yeah, it's impressive how far technology's come. Okay, what else did we miss about this wine?
Let's see.
So I also wanted to add, so these first two vines came from the Couts family vineyards, and then the third one is from your vineyard. So just before we move on, I wanted to touch on kind of why Couts family at Ironstone, we care so much about the lands and so much about the history, and that's why we're here. We're fourth generation farmers in Lodi, and so we definitely have a stake in the history here, and that's why maintaining these vines is so important to us. And we want to share how beautiful and unique Lodi is with the world, but we can't do it if people keep ripping up all of these beautiful old vines. You know, I think it's worth being said that as the vines age, they're not as productive. You don't create as many grapes, right? But so it's not as profitable for the farmers, and that's obviously a factor. You know, you have to make a living. But I think when you look at the quality that you get and the history behind it, I think that you kind of understand the balance and the importance of keeping the vines in the ground.
Yeah. One of the things that I didn't mention is these 5 vineyards that are part of this particular wine, the 65 to 85-year-old wine. They are all in a fairly small area. It's within the Lodi appellation, but there's a sub-appellation called the McCollamy sub-appellation, and all these vineyards are within about 3 miles of each other. They're all very close together. They're all in really exceptionally sandy soils, and it's all around this town called Victor. So I call it the Victor Triangle. And Yeah, that's just me calling it that. But it's a triangle in this area where these 5 vineyards are, and it's exceptionally sandy soils, and these vines have been here for up to 85 years, a really long time. And it's because of the sandy soils and the weather and all the things we talked about earlier that makes them so incredibly attractive as wine when they're made properly and aged properly, like we do at Ironstone.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so quick history of what these vines have seen. Ready? Little perspective. All right, so these vines have seen the Cold War, when NASA was founded, Elvis Presley's first hit, Heartbreak Hotel, I Love Lucy came out, the first James Bond novel before the movies, Albert Einstein was still alive, Mahatma Gandhi's whole life, the entirety of World War II, the United Nations was created, the Pentagon was just being built, and the first Superman comic. So the only presidents that we add to this list are Truman and Franklin D. Roosevelt. So
Roosevelt would have served 4 terms, and that's not allowed anymore.
It's not allowed anymore, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so on to the gem, your very own Ancient Vine Zinfandel from the Rous Vineyard.
Okay, here we go. Here's the label. This is the 109, this number right here. That indicates the age of the vines during the harvest year. So these vines were actually planted in 1909. So that would have been 2018 when this vintage was grown and harvested and made into wine. Mm-hmm. So if you find that 109 on the bottle, that's how you can interpret what that really means. So these are not kids. These vines have been around a long time. And every spring, it astounds me that they know what to do. They come out and they bloom in, and it's like, my goodness. Yeah, it's just amazing to me that they can do it. This next year is going to be 112, and they still come out and they still produce grapes, and they still look wonderful in the vineyard. So yeah, I'm just always amazed at how grapes can do that.
Yeah, they know. They know what to do. They don't need us at all, really.
They really don't. Yeah, on the classic Zinfandel, I call that young vines. I call that the exuberance of youth. And they need a little bit of help on how to crop properly and how to do everything. These old guys, man, they just want you to ignore them and not do much because they know what to do. They've been there before.
Yeah.
They've been doing it a whole lot longer than I'm an old guy, and they've been doing a lot longer than me.
No, you're not. And I know that you have a policy of really not interfering with the vines too.
Right. Yeah. You let them do their thing, and we're very fortunate that we really don't have much pest pressure here in Lodi, and so you're able to get away with. The only thing we do is we just spray with sulfur, and that's it. So we're able to really get away with almost nothing. Very minimal intrusion into the vineyard, and so these grapes just are pretty darn natural. That's for sure.
That's great. And these are actually on St. George rootstock.
These are on St. George rootstock. Now, that's unusual. We were talking about own-rooted earlier, and most old vines in Lodi are on their own root. They just took a stick and put it in the ground. It started going. St. George is an old rootstock, came from France from when they had phylloxera. And it's well adapted to sandy soils. It does really well, but it doesn't produce an awful lot of fruit. Mm-hmm. Well, that's okay for 109-year-old vines. That's kind of what they do. But yeah, it's really unusual. In Lodi, we only know of one other vineyard that is on St. George rootstock that is older than this one. So among the oldest for sure in Lodi, and among the oldest in California too, on St. George rootstock. So it's kind of a neat thing.
Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah. That's really cool.
Yeah, it's kind of cool. Yeah.
And it's a small vineyard too. It's 10 acres.
It's 10 acres. But I'll tell you what, remember we talked about 20 acres, mm-hmm. which a family could do, right? Well, that was when they had tractors. a family had a Caterpillar tractor in the 30s and 40s and 50s. Well, back when these were planted in 1909, most people didn't have tractors. They were still using horse-drawn plows and discs, and when you established a vineyard back then, you had a tank of water, and you took a bucket, and the horse would draw you through the vineyard, and you'd dump a bucket next to the vine, and hopefully it got enough water to survive.
Oh my God.
So yeah, it was very, very different. Farming technology, horse-drawn plows, and it must have been really neat to see. But boy, what a lot of work! And so again, one family doing all that, 10 acres is a lot for one family to do manually like that.
Yeah, very labor and time intensive, and also back in that time frame, most people were still farming most of their own food, and they also had probably cattle or chickens or sheep or hogs or something like that as well. So they had the rest of the homestead to manage. They weren't getting their food from the grocery store down the street. They grew most of it. People at that time frame were mostly buying only like coffee and sugar and that type of thing.
Yeah, flour. Yeah, the real basics.
Mm-hmm.
They had to grow everything else. And of course, wine at that time was a basic. That was considered part of your meal.
Right.
In Lodi, there were a lot of Germans. And so, yeah, that was part of their culture. And a lot of Italians, and clearly part of their culture to have wine. So it wasn't something that you did every once in a while. You had it almost
luxury.
all the time.
Yeah,
you had it all the time.
Yeah, wine was not a luxury item the way it's considered today. It was part of daily life.
It was an everyday one. It was an everyday thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So,
that's really cool.
Yeah, it was quite different.
Yeah. And so I just wanted to touch on real quick, both with your vineyards and with the Couts families as well, how being sustainable has allowed these vineyards to last for so long. I mean, we talked about with yours that very, very hands-off approach. I mean, you don't really do anything. You hardly even walk in those vineyards. I've heard you say before.
Yeah, I rarely put a tractor in them, and I do walk them with some more regularity, but I don't like to get any equipment in there at all.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting because the vines are so gnarled and curled and everything that each vine has their own population of spiders and lizards and all these things, and they eat bad bugs that show up. So it's kind of neat how a very natural pest control. The few pests that we do have, they get eaten by the spiders and the lizards.
That's perfect.
It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why these vineyards can last for so long. You know, when you let nature take its course and you don't spray it with all kinds of chemicals and you don't pack the sand or pack the soils down with all these tractors and everything like that, you really, these vineyards will last you over 100 years if you let them. And I think
we really don't know how long a vineyard can last in California. I think the oldest vineyard that we know about was 1869. And that's up in Amador County. There's one here in Lodi. It was 1888. And that's the oldest one we know about here. So if you treat them right and take care of them, they'll last a really long time.
Yeah.
A lot longer than we will, that's for sure.
Absolutely. When the humans are gone, the vines will persist.
The vines will still be here.
So tell me about some of the tasting notes and characteristics we can expect out of your ancient Rous vines in Zinfandel, Craig.
Now, we were talking about the reserve being softer and more elegant, richer and complex. Well, this is just another step above that. Although this one, we often describe this as having kind of a floral-like character. Now, not floral like muscat, but floral like violets, like flowers. It's very different. You still get the raspberry, you still get the blackberries, but there's also a very unusual violet component in this. Mm-hmm. And it's really attractive. I just find it very, course, it's my vineyard, but I still find, even if it wasn't, I'd still find it very attractive. And
Yeah.
I have found it in a few other really old vineyards, but it's very uncommon.
Mm-hmm.
So in the mouth, it has a very soft, again, the tannins I was talking about earlier don't pound you over the head. They're really soft. They're mouth filling, but they're not astringent.
Mm-hmm.
It's even more pronounced in this oldest grapes that you see. There's just, we keep hitting on elegant, but somehow it just describes what this wine is. It's really elegant, soft, rich, full.
Yeah, absolutely. And for food pairings, I would probably still pair it with what I would go for the reserve, the 65 to 85-year-old one with, a braised beef or something like that. But I could also maybe back it off a little too and go towards a lighter style chicken dish or something, maybe even a heavy fish like a swordfish or something like that, because as we're saying, it's a little bit more of that elegant, lighter, floral style Zinfandel. And by floral, we don't mean sweet. By floral, we mean that like very hint of violet, almost a very, very deep red rose type of floral that's so unusual and so unique to this area and to ancient vines Zinfandel.
Yeah. Now, the one thing also that, we have said that these wines are not light, but elegant. Well, it doesn't mean that they're light in color, because that's not true at all. They're actually, as you go from the classic to the reserve to the Rous, the color actually gets darker. Mm-hmm. So when we say lighter, doesn't mean that they're light style. They are just more elegant, softer, more mouth-filling, richer. You don't want to be caught in that trap of thinking lighter. Oh, I don't like light wines. Yeah. So it's not that at all.
They're still
very full.
Yeah, it's still a Zinfandel. It's still a big, powerful California Zinfandel. Right. So I think we're using light in a relative term.
Exactly. It doesn't mean light wine, soft, and there's nothing there. That's not that at all.
Not light like a Pinot Noir, light like an ancient vine Zinfandel.
There you go. That's it. That's it. Yeah.
Yeah, this is a really, really beautiful wine. And would you show us or take a look on the back? I know the case production is on the back, and all of our reserves come in 6-packs, and they all have the case production on there. And I think it's just over 1,000 cases for that one.
Just a little bit more. Yeah, this is actually 1,400 cases, which really means 700 cases of 12-packs. So what we normally think of. Yeah. So not very much. The production's pretty small.
Yeah.
And the other thing that you want to remember about this wine, this is 100% Rous Zin. There's no blenders. There's no other vineyard. It's 100% from the Rous vineyard. And that in itself is very unusual too. Oftentimes winemakers will sneak in something that'll increase the color or do a different flavor. Not this one. This is 100%. And that's quite unusual, particularly for something this old.
Yeah.
It's hard to make a single vineyard with nothing else added. But that just shows you how good those grapes are, and of course the skill of Ironstone winemaking can take that and do it. It's really kind of neat to see.
It is really neat. Yeah, that is super rare, actually.
Yeah, it's very, very uncommon.
Yeah, it's really cool.
Yeah.
What else did you want to add about this wine before I take you through a history of what these vines have seen?
Well, let's see. We were talking about grape growing. Yeah, I think we already did, because one of the things I already talked about horse-drawn plows, buckets of water instead of irrigation. I just can't imagine how it was back in those days to grow grapes and to keep them and to maintain them. Yeah, I just don't know how the guys did it.
Yeah, and the winemaking.
It's astounding.
Yeah, and the winemaking again was in probably a hand press and maybe open barrel tanks, something like that.
Well, they didn't have barrels back then.
Oh, right. So
they would have had wood containers because they didn't have stainless steel.
Right.
They would have had wood containers, but they may have been redwood.
Right.
Or they may have been old whiskey barrels or something. They really didn't have individual wine barrels back then. So the barrel wasn't used to add flavor. It was used because it's the only thing you could keep it in.
Yeah.
It did add flavor, yes, but it was just because that's the only thing you could keep it in.
Yeah.
Because they were made in relatively small lots, several hundred to maybe 1,000 gallons each, not very much. And so you had to break it down and keep everything topped. It was hard to do back then. No stainless steel, no refrigeration, no way to keep the wine cool. You had to put it in an underground cellar or something like that. So, yeah, it was very primitive in comparison to what we do now,
Yeah.
for sure.
Okay, so quick history of more things that these vines have seen. Are you ready? All right. Bonnie and Clyde were still robbing banks. Alcatraz opened. Al Capone was convicted for tax fraud. These survived the Great Depression. The Star-Spangled Banner had just become the national anthem. These saw the Dust Bowl years. These saw the invention of Betty Boop and Mickey Mouse. Penicillin was invented. Women gained the right to vote. The entirety of World War I. First crossword puzzle, which I thought was kind of cool, 1913. The Titanic sank. Okay.
1912.
Yep. And then 1909, 1910, apparently nothing, super important happened because I couldn't find anything else. Okay.
No, the Rous vineyard was planted.
There we go. The Rous vineyard was planted. Okay.
That's historical.
It's very historical. So presidents were adding to the roster. We're adding Hoover, Coolidge, Harding, Wilson, Taft, and Theodore Roosevelt. I know.
Yeah.
It's so cool, right? The last thing I want to touch on before we start to wrap up is how people can get these wines if they didn't get them for the tasting that they have with us today. Everything is on the website, ironstonevineyards.com, and there's actually a bundle of these already together under the virtual tasting tabs, but all of our wines are available in the wine shop and we can ship them directly to your house. And we're working on adding some more states to our shipping licenses as we speak, so that's really exciting. So everything's available online, and we can hopefully get it to you or bring it to one of your favorite retailers.
Support local and support the little guys.
I love that, and support families, which is what this is here. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what the Counts family is a family. So
everything's a family owned or operated. You count as family, Craig.
Thank you.
Estate grown, everything's made in our own winemaking facility. I mean, it's really hands-on, and I think that that's getting harder and harder to find in winemaking in California these days. Awesome. Is there anything else you wanted to add today, Craig, before we wrap up?
Well, this is the Rous Zinfandel Ancient Vine Zin. Go out and get some. You'll love it.
Go out and get some. Cheers, Craig. Thank you so much for joining today. I really appreciate your time.
You're welcome, Kate. Bye-bye.
Bye.